Hello, I'm Oliver Colling, and this is my 70s TV childhood. Welcome back to my 70s TV childhood. We are a podcast which looks back to a golden age of childhood experienced by those of us who were brought up in the UK during the 1970s. It was a time of fun days out playing with our friends, learning about life, especially from starting at school, and, as new listeners might have gathered from what our podcast is called, a time when lots of us enjoyed watching television. It's not necessarily the quality of what was on at that time that we remember, although there were some great TV programmes, but that shared experience of sitting down with our families and friends, watching shows which formed a collective place in our society's consciousness in a way that nothing has before or since. If this is your first time listening, then a very warm welcome. And if you're a regular listener, thanks for your continued support. I know some of you have been listening since we started the podcast back in 2020, so if you're one of those long-term supporters, thank you, and I have to say I admire your stamina. As always, we'd love to hear what you think about the podcast, and also to hear your memories of your own childhoods. We've had some fantastic memories shared by listeners, and you can share yours by leaving a comment on our blog at www.my70stvchildhood.com, on one of our many social media pages by searching for My 70s TV Childhood, or you can drop me a line to oliver@my70stvchildhood.com. Now, I won't spend too much time going through our bulging digital postbag this time, but I will mention some feedback I've had from Mark via our YouTube channel. In our recent episode featuring the Tomorrow People, I made reference to a story called A Man for Emily, which features some aliens who I thought were cannibals. Now, thanks for pointing it out, Mark, but this was not the case. I suppose it just shows what about 50 years does when I tried to remember it. Where I got that idea from, I don't know, but I'm happy to set the record straight. It was, after all, a long, long time ago. Speaking of which, I was doing a bit of cleaning out of some old boxes recently, and I picked up an old shoebox and inside found a treasure trove of 70s childhood bits and pieces. Not only did I find some old Panini football stickers from the Argentina 78 collection, but also a few Topps chewing gum football cards, which were actually really good, really well made and informative. There was also a Tin Sheriff's badge, some Robinson's Marmalade badges, which I won't dwell upon given their subject, and two items which have in part inspired what we'll be talking about for the rest of this episode. These were a Tufty Club badge, one of many I possess, I think, because I think I joined it, probably like many of you, several times over the years, and a very interesting piece of paper. I had a police document from Warrington Police Station from May 1976 with my fingerprints on it. Now, before you get too carried away, I'm not going to exclusively reveal the previously unknown life of crime. No, the fingerprints were done during a school field trip to the police station, part of which involved a few lucky volunteers getting their fingerprints taken and being locked in a police cell. I mentioned in previous episodes some of the very dull school trips we used to go on from primary school, but this one was one of the more exciting ones. After all, the whole idea of villains and police going head-to-head was one which featured in lots of TV shows at the time. We look back at some of the TV shows featuring the police in our episode from May 2021 called Watching the Detectives, where we looked at shows like Dixon of Dock Green with its hero played by an actor in his 70s, and the revolutionary Z-Cars with its gritty realism on the streets of Newtown, which was a thinly disguised version of Kirby in Liverpool, not so far away from where I grew up. The discovery of the Tufty Club badge and the fingerprints made me think of what I remember about law enforcement and policing when I was growing up as a child in the 1970s. From an early age, I was always aware of the police, largely because Padgate Police Station was very close to where we lived. I would guess it was a Victorian building and there were always police officers on duty at the counter, even though Padgate was still a small village. As a child, I used to see one of the village policemen, and I think they were all men at that point, most days. They'd either be walking up and down the street, be on a bicycle, or if you were very lucky, they'd go past in the blue and white Panda car, which seemed to be parked outside the police station most of the time, rather than out fighting crime. Now, I'm not an expert on law enforcement, and I'm not making any sort of political statement here, but what I can't understand is how Padgate, a relatively small village in the 1970s, had a fully manned police station and a highly visible police presence across the community. And how we've got to the point where you hardly ever see a police officer, let alone know them by name. Now, I'm sure the nature and the sophistication of crime and the methods used to detect it have advanced over the last 50 years, but it seems very strange to me that personal policing has been replaced by something, well, which feels very impersonal. I don't remember much in the way of crime at that time, other than the odd child stealing sweets from Hartley's, the village shop. But in a few short years, the village police station had gone to be replaced by a rarely staffed police information point, and the level and nature of crime committed had changed, and not for the better. Indeed, there was an infamous shocking murder which took place in Padgate in the 2000s, which happened, rather ironically, very close to where the police station had once stood. As well as the local bobbies on the beat or on their bikes, we also had regular visits at school from the police, most notably to talk about road safety. Now, I think I've mentioned in previous episodes about PC Snow, who used to come into school to show us road safety films, and always persuade us to sign up to the Tufty Club, which I know many of you belong to across the country. In those early years at school, though, there was another important source of information on the police, and that, of course, was via the television. And as well as the old-fashioned shows mentioned earlier like Dixon of Dock Green, there was one show in particular which inspired more playground games and probably fights than any other. The Sweeney was a perfect show for young children, even if they weren't really supposed to watch it. The first appearance of Jack Regan and co. came in an episode of ITV's Armchair Theatre shown on 4th of June 1974, almost exactly 50 years ago from the planned release date of this episode of our podcast. To celebrate this very special anniversary, we're going to take a look back at the Sweeney and just explore how it became such a huge part of our social and cultural history. That first episode, or pilot as I suppose we should describe it, featured many of the traits we have come to know and love from the fictionalised version of the flying squad shown in the series. The first time we meet Jack Regan is making an arrest when he bursts into a suspect's bedroom, finding him in bed with his girlfriend, and shouts some immortal lines.
Get your trousers on. You're nicked. Get him in the car. You can have a lie-in, darling.
So where did the inspiration for what was to become a legend come from? Well, in the 1960s and 70s, corruption had almost become a way of life for certain parts of the Metropolitan Police Force. So whilst in my village the police officers walked down the road to deal with the shoplifters stealing sweeties from the village shop, in London there were squads of coppers driving around in fast cars, carrying guns and sorting out tasty villains. The Flying Squad, as they'd become known, got lots of their intelligence from the criminal underworld, and it seems like the lines between good and evil became a bit blurred to say the least. There were lots of high-profile press exposés of officers socialising with villains, drinking in the same dodgy London boozers, and even going on holiday together to the Spanish costas. Bribery was known about, and many Flying Squad officers were quietly dismissed or retired, but very few seemed to face justice. This was a real source of pain to those on the inside who didn't take bribes or go on holiday with gangland villains. And one man in particular, an officer called Dave Wilson, persuaded a TV scriptwriter called Ian Kennedy Martin to come and see some of what was going on in the hope that he could persuade him to write this up and it could be shown on screen. On one occasion, apparently, Wilson took Kennedy Martin to a pub that was frequented by notable villains and by Flying Squad officers. And Kennedy Martin genuinely couldn't tell the difference between the two, and hence the idea for the Sweeney was born. Houston Films had already made arrangements to film a series based on the pilot before it had even been shown, and the critical response to the first show was hugely positive. Regan was a different kind of detective to the kindly, rather doddery George Dixon. He could be just as cruel, just as violent, and just as ruthless as the villains. But under it all, he was a good, honest man, looking to make a difference by getting villains locked up. And that was that. The first episode of the show proper was broadcast on the 2nd of January 1975, and by October of the same year, it had taken the country by storm and got to the top of the TV ratings. So what was it about the show that was so popular to 10-year-old boys like me, as well as the general viewing audience? Well, I think there are several reasons. The series was shot in 16mm film, giving it a sort of gritty realism not always found in the studio-bound cop shows. The locations used were genuinely seedy and showed London, to us northern outsiders, as a dirty, tired capital city inhabited by a range of dodgy cockney geezers, brassy hard-as-nails women, and a police force trying to keep order against a rising tide of violence and crime. Oh, and it was also full of action-packed chases, fights and raids which kept the adrenaline flowing. At its heart, the show was about the relationship between two hard but fair coppers, Jack Regan, played by the great John Thor, and his sergeant George Carter, played by Dennis Waterman. They were both perfect for the parts they played, and their on-screen chemistry was very powerful. They looked like real people, and they spoke and acted like real people. They were also flawed like real people, and prone to making mistakes or errors of judgment, which led to bad things happening and fatalities in some cases. They drank too much, smoked too much, and had, particularly in Regan's case, how shall we put it, complicated love lives. George Carter did have a wife at one point, but unfortunately, in one of the episodes she was murdered in a hit-and-run incident. The show also featured some fantastic cars. The Ford Motor Company provided vehicles for the show on the condition that they were driven by the police, and one of the stars of the show was a 3-litre, sort of goldy brown coloured Ford Consular, which Regan travelled in with whatever heavies from the flying squad were accompanying him on that particular raid. The villains tended to drive old Jaguars, which, more often than not, ended up in crashes. All brilliant fun for small boys like me. The script writing, locations, and the brilliant casting led to a fantastic series where you were rooting for Regan and Carter in spite of the fact they were only a few degrees away from the villains they pursued in their behaviour. This was 1970s Britain at its ugliest and its rawest, and we loved it. Oh, and we shouldn't forget DCI Frank Haskins, Regan's long-suffering boss, who always seemed to be somewhat disapproving of how his men behaved, but was prepared to back them to the hilt against those who worked against them, not least the corrupt coppers who were supposed to be on the same side. He was brilliantly played by Garfield Morgan, and he was as much a part of the show's success as the two leads themselves. Looking back, some commentators have dismissed the Sweeney as being a crude, violent police show featuring shouty, uncouth detectives, but I think that's far too simplistic. The show stands alone as a masterpiece of British television history. All of its parts added up to a great whole. We'll never see anything like it again. It's also easy to forget how popular the show was. At its height, as well as topping the ratings, it spawned 2 film spin-offs. The first one, called simply Sweeney, was pretty good, I think. And as an X-certificate, it allowed the violence, shock and adult content to be dialed up a bit. It's well worth a watch if you haven't seen it. There were also other spin-offs. I remember a Sweeney annual, which sounds rather inappropriate, and I also had a Sweeney Letraset kit. Do you remember Letraset? You had lots of transfers on a sort of hard plastic sheet that you rubbed off onto a cardboard card which had a background on it. The Sweeney one was quite violent, so who on earth thought this was a good idea and suitable to sit alongside the kits featuring, say, Donald Duck or a bunch of fluffy woodland animals? I don't know. But I didn't mind, though, because I thought it was absolutely brilliant. The Sweeney came to an end after 4 series and 53 episodes, all of which were brilliant, but, I find, sometimes hard to distinguish between, given they often featured similar elements of action sequences, bent coppers, Regan shouting at people, and scenes in dodgy pubs. One I do remember particularly was the one that featured Morecambe and Wise, which I have mentioned in a previous podcast. It was perfect. The most popular comedians in the country joining with the most popular TV show of the year, and I remember it being pretty good too.
Get all this lot cleaned up, will you, Jack? I'll see you two back at the office. Sorry about him, fellas, but he's actually a great fan of yours.
It almost showed. Must be a gift.
Well, we better start getting back, George. Sort this lot out.
I'm sorry about this, fellas. Is there anything we can do for you?
Well, what are you doing on the 25th of this month?
A police concert?
The final episode, Jack or Knave, was a fitting end to the series. Not for the first time, Regan's accused of corruption, and it looks like he'll finally be nobbled by the bad guys. But George Carter comes to the rescue, and Regan is exonerated. But it's proved to be one step too far for Jack, and he's had enough.
Congratulations, Jack.
Yeah, well done.
George, I owe you. You know that. Can't wait to have you back on the firm, Jack.
You're going to have to wait a long time, Frank, after this little lot.
Come on, Jack. There's no need to be like that.
I want to be like that, Frank. Do you know why? Because I am utterly and abjectly pissed off with this little lot. I've given the best years of my life to the job. I've got 18 bloody commendations, if you include the one I didn't get yesterday. And how does this wonderful police force show its gratitude for all my years of unstinting effort? It bangs me up in a crabby little cell like some cheap little villain. All because a tow rag called Hutchinson's got a few bottles twitching on the 5th floor. Now, because that poor little bastard had the guts to get off his arse, I'm going to have to be reinstated. And what do you bunch of bleeding double-dyed hypocrites want now? You want me to crawl back to work and be terribly grateful that I didn't get nicked for something I didn't do? Well, you can stuff it.
What a great closing line. And with that, he leaves the police station and, despite George's best efforts, jumps into a cab and drives away. And that was that. Next stop for John Thor, Inspector Morse. What would Jack Regan have made of that? Have you got any memories of the Sweeney you'd like to share? Did you run around the playground pretending to be Regan and Carter like I and my friends did? Let me know via our blog at www.my70stvchildhood.com. Leave a comment on our various social media sites or email me, oliver@my70stvchildhood.com. We'll be back next week with another edition of our quiz to test your 1970s TV trivia knowledge, and in a fortnight with our next regular podcast. Until then, take care. Don't forget to like, rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. And join us again soon for more from My 70s TV Childhood.